Hi, I'm Dennis Chalmers-Saunders, here from the University High School of Science and Engineering, along with my colleagues
Noah Ehrlich,
Anna Christie,
and Kevin Lindstrom.
And today we'll be presenting Women in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We'll begin with the history. In 1885, King Leopold II of Belgium made the Congo his private property, forcing the local population into exploitative trades. 75 years later, led by Patrice Lumumba, the country gained independence. Peace did not last long, with a coup happening just a few months later, where Lumumba was executed and Joseph Desiré Mobutu took partial power. He gained full power a few years later in a second coup. The late 1990s brought increased tensions with the Tutsi people, which helped spark the First Congo War. Mobutu was expelled from the country and rebel leader Laurent Kabila was placed into power. 2 years later, due to internal tensions, the Second Congo War broke out, where 4 million died, mostly due to starvation and disease. 20 armed groups became involved in the continued conflict as Kabila was assassinated and his son Joseph came into power. This continued instability has created a cycle of conflict, destruction of land and opportunity, and social unrest in the DRC. And now our thesis, that globalization has negatively affected women in the Democratic Republic of the Congo through ineffective foreign aid, the arms trade, and neoliberal policy. Now to speak on foreign aid, welfare colonialism, and neoliberal policy, please welcome Noah Ehrlich.
Thank you, Dennis. The total requested humanitarian aid to the DRC is $1.7 billion US. This is provided by the international community as well as the UN, and is requested both by the DRC's own government as well as NGOs operating in the country. Last year, the total estimated international investment was $4.7 billion US. This comes from commercial and private sources, government assistance, as well as IMF and World Bank funds. One of the largest impacts of foreign aid in the country is in the DRC's extremely poor healthcare system. Foreign aid has been instrumental in stopping outbreaks of numerous diseases, including cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, Ebola, and other hemorrhagic fevers. Foreign aid has also been instrumental in reducing polio cases by 99.9%, as well as HIV cases by 40% since their high in the late 1990s. However, the reinstitution of an American policy called the Mexico City gag rule is set to reverse this. The Mexico City gag rule prevents USAID from being used by any NGO that provides abortion or contraceptive services. This negatively impacts women's reproductive rights, as well as the fight against AIDS in the country. However, the vast majority of foreign aid coming to the DRC is ineffective. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, foreign aid is ineffective because it is not aligned with the receiving country's goals and priorities. It has poor planning and framework, meaning that money is not used efficiently, short time commitments, meaning that goals are not seen to fruition, as well as programs lack transparency, opening up to easy corruption and embezzlement. This is only compounded by the political turmoil in the country. Additionally, the lack of upwards movement severely curtails the overall impact that foreign aid could have. The government is increasingly dependent on international investment, meaning it is disconnected and unaccountable to the people. This disproportionately affects women as they have fewer support structures within the country and rely more heavily on foreign aid. According to Transparency International, which rates all countries on a scale from 0 to 10, with 0 being highly corrupt and 10 being not corrupt, the DRC is rated at 1.9. This corruption extends to all parts of the government, including the military, where half of money allocated for soldier salaries was embezzled by higher-ups. This means that husbands working in the military cannot send money back to their wives. Additionally, 60 to 80% of customs duties, which represent the largest single income source for the DRC, were left uncollected. This means that the DRC does not have money to fund infrastructure or healthcare improvements, as well as fund social programs, especially those for women. Additionally, foreign aid was used in the election of Joseph Kabila. He runs an oppressive regime of repressing the rights of women. All of this is allowed to happen due to the lack of legislation and poor implementation of existing laws. IMF and World Bank funds are used to exert Western influence on the country, liberalizing its trade policy and monetary policy. In 2015, $1 billion worth of IMF funds were suspended due to the political turmoil in the country, making it inhospitable for Western trade interests. All of this creates a country dependent on international investment in foreign aid, with its citizens dependent on humanitarian aid for their survival, and the government dependent on international investment for their continued existence. Additionally, foreign aid is not focused on growing the economy, increasing the DRC's reliance on global trade. All of this creates a situation called welfare colonialism, where money is used for the explicit purpose of stabilizing the country and opening it up to Western influence, and opening the resources of the DRC to Western exploitation. Additionally, coercion is used through the implied threat of aid withdrawal to ensure that the DRC implements policies that are sympathetic towards Western corporations and not help its own people. The liberalization of the DRC's economy means that it is increasingly reliant on global trade and that women have a harder time finding jobs in the economy, as Kevin will later explain. Overall, aid is focused on continuing and increasing international access to the DRC's resources and not on helping the people. And now, Anna with the internal conflict.
Thank you, Noah. Because of internal conflict in the DRC, men are away from home and women are forced to be both head of household and breadwinners. There's been an overwhelming presence of child labor in the nation. In fact, 37.1% of all children ages 7 to 14 work and attend school simultaneously. Most of these children work for big mining companies that comprise the nation's resource-based economy. The government has made efforts to eliminate child labor, however, they have proven futile. Child labor and lack of education negatively impacts women's productivity later in life. Continued conflict in the DRC is fueled by an influx of guns and ammunition from international traders. The conflict leads to a decrease in human rights, increase in rape, and destabilization of the government. In 2003, there were UN arms embargoes for the DRC. However, 5 years later, in 2008, they were lifted. Current policy is to notify the Sanctions Committee of all arms shipments into the country. However, this doesn't happen. Continued proliferation of the arms trade will be detrimental to the peace process that the same international community advocates for. In 2011, there were 30,000 child soldiers in the DRC. This accounted for about 15 to 30% of all soldiers. Soldiers loot villages and take children as young as 13. These children are indoctrinated, forced to become executioners and suicide bombers. At first, they fight as a means to survive, but then they are brainwashed into belief in the cause. This keeps the conflict going for decades to come, perpetuating the cycle. Children, often girls, also join the military voluntarily. They're promised a better life and join as a means to escape the poverty that surrounds their own household. After joining the military, they are often abused, sometimes sexually. These situations cause psychological scarring and hurt women's development later in life. The influx of weaponry keeps soldiers armed, perpetuating conflict, continuing looting of villages, and killing and raping of women. Rape is used as a weapon to intimidate women and their families. The epidemic is due to an ineffective justice system, poor governance, and women's generally low social standing. Global influence in the DRC intensifies the conflict, and women directly observe the negative effects. And now, Kevin Lindstrom will talk about the socioeconomic standing of women.
Thank you, Anna. The DRC is generally ranked as not free by Freedom House, which is an independent freedom studying organization. The DRC received a score of 19 out of 100 points last year, in which 100 was the most free. This is a 6-point decrease from the year prior. Freedom House remarks that civilians and opposition politicians are increasingly unable to influence politics by participating in elections. This is primarily because of violent government repression of its people. In the past couple of years, there has been crackdowns and government protests and people peacefully demonstrating against a repressive regime, and they're advocating for democracy. This creates an environment in which women cannot even advocate for their own advancement in society because the basic fundamental democratic ideas of freedom of speech and the right to assemble are not respected. Within the preamble of the nation's constitution, it states that they adhere to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Rights of Women. However, there is a number of policies and social ideas that contradict this affirmation. Firstly, marital rape in the country is not unlawful. And in rural areas, marriage is often used as a means to close the case. This means that women are married to their rapists. In addition, the Congo Family Code states that a wife owes obedience to her husband. Women can't even advocate for the abolition of these policies and social structures because they only make up 9% of the nation's parliament, and this number is on a decreasing trend. In addition, the DRC has really low education rates, but within these low rates, there's a significant disparity between men and women. The following statistics are females as a percent of males, And for example, the adult literacy rate is about 59%. This means that for every 100 literate adult males, there's only 60 literate adult females. This disparity is in the youth, and it's within the education system as a whole. The survival rate to the last grade of primary school is only about 81.2% for women, which means women are not surviving in education and they're not staying in school as long as men. In the graph to the right, it shows that there's a disparity in enrollment rates and net attendance as well, and this is increasing as the level of schooling increases. Overall, investors are profiting from the government policies, but its citizens are not. For instance, in the Congo, families have to pay for their own education, and so they're significantly less likely to pay for their daughter's education over their sons, and that's a reason why the gap exists. In the liberalization of the economy, as Noah talked about earlier, women aren't able to compete because they're not able to obtain well-paying skilled jobs, and those are a really small proportion of all jobs as a whole. In the graph below, the solid line represents the government's GDP, or the GDP as a nation as a whole, whereas the lowest dotted line represents the GDP per capita. Basically, within recent years, Western nations have been contributing a lot to the government GDP, and they've been influencing and growing the nation's economy. However, this nation's economy isn't dependent on the nation's citizens. They don't make a lot of money. And as Noah remarked earlier, this means that the government is now unaccountable to its citizens because its revenue isn't coming from taxes. It's coming from tariffs and international trade, which is why the government doesn't provide education to its citizens, because it's not dependent on them. Therefore, it's only dependent on the trade that comes in, and it's only implementing policy that's sympathetic to that, not towards women or any citizens as a whole. Overall, perpetuation in the nation's conflict results in a society that is fixated on its own survival and not developing rights and privileges. You can see this through the education system, you can see this through many different social structures in which women don't even have basic rights. And now, Dennis with our conclusion.
Thank you, Kevin. Through our research, we've been able to conclude that global influence in the DRC has created a nation dependent on foreign entities and has strengthened the cycle of conflict, destruction, and tension. Globalization has had a negative effect on women in the DRC that is harmful to the development and advancement of their rights. Thank you. And now we're work cited.
Yeah.
Keep scrolling.
So questions?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll start it off. So you mentioned the Civil War as an element that is keeping investment out, and it's increasing corruption. So unpack the Civil War for me. Is this a tribal thing? Is this based on religious lines? Describe the internal conflict a little bit.
Well, there are many tribal groups that exist in the area that we know as the Congo, and they occasionally have, well, in the history of the country, they have warred with each other, and this tension that builds and builds and finally erupts into a war. The wars hurt the citizens, and they allow for the opportunity for armed groups. There's more than 20 armed groups that come in, and they will take over certain sections of the country and make it very difficult for the citizens to, especially women, to gain any advantage or foothold.
Go ahead.
And increasingly, more recently, the conflict has been less fueled by tribal distinctions, but more fueled by everybody vying for political power. And the most recent refugees that are leaving the country are leaving primarily because of the conflict related to political power. As well as during the entire conflict, there was significant influence from outside countries. There were militant groups coming from Rwanda, Uganda, and other countries surrounding the DRC that helped to fuel the conflict as well.
And to continue that, with the fact that there's so many armed rebel groups, every reason for fighting is different. But one of the things I'd like to note is that the government recently has actually supported about 3 of the rebel groups within its own country, because they basically recognize if we band together, we can repress all of the other groups and fight against them. And the government has actually contracted and given arms to groups that are claiming that they're against them, just so they can eradicate other smaller rebel groups in the area. And overall, the government and these groups realize that if they continue the conflict, they can continue basically getting arms and gaining power and not having to care about anyone else in their country.
So even though today it's more of a political conflict, it did really much start out as more tribal groups.
Mm-hmm. What about resource economics? So there's a lot of diamonds in the DRC.
Yes.
Right,
Yeah.
so that's one thing, when Noah mentioned that the government isn't accountable to its people,
Mhm.
and Kevin mentioned that that's why they don't provide education, the government doesn't rely on the people's education and skilled labor, but it does very much require the unskilled labor of children and of women
Mm-hmm.
to stimulate the resource-based economy.
Yep.
Yeah, and
So-
so the economy of the DRC is overwhelmingly reliant on exports of resources.
Mm-hmm.
It produces 60% of the world's cobalt, which is increasingly used for lithium-ion batteries.
Mhm.
Recently, there's been a number of deals between the DRC's government as well as international mining groups with companies such as Apple, Samsung, as well as a number of Chinese electronic groups to purchase cobalt in bulk, as well as they produce a significant portion of the world's copper, a lot of the world's non-ferrous base metals, such as silicon. Coltan's another big export. However, there's also a significant portion that is smuggled out of the country. One study related specifically to the logging industry. The logging industry is reportedly 1% of the gross national product. However, it's estimated to be 7 times larger, as a lot of the logging is smuggled out of the country to not pay custom duties and other taxes.
With your remark, you talked about diamonds and that sort of stuff, and obviously whenever you think about exploitation of resources, you think about blood diamonds and under-the-counter trading. However, what really surprised us is that within the DRC, this doesn't really happen as much as you would think, because Western nations and companies actually realize that if they go through this government, even though it's a bit corrupt, it's more stable than the other groups within the country. So it's actually beneficial for them to trade with this and deal with a little bit of tariffs, because it means that they'll be able to continue trading for a longer time.
And there's also been a lot of Western outrage in the civilian population about blood diamonds. And that there's been a lot of documentary films and other advertisements that have really pushed companies away from blood diamonds. And so that's really been the push to stop a lot of the rebel groups exporting materials and more focus on the government.
And the sort of whole point, the reason we included neoliberal policy in this presentation is Western corporations want to provide the cheapest product possible to their consumers so they can outcompete their competitors. Well, the whole entire nation of the DRC is dependent on exporting these raw materials to these corporations in order to survive. So they're not going to make a policy to prevent child labor, even though they say they do. It's against their interest, because they need to continue outcompeting the other nations with these resources, and be the lowest bidder, because their nation won't exist, their government won't exist without it. And then the people who own these mines at the same time, it's in their interest to employ children and all that sort of stuff, because they want to produce the cheapest product possible. So with the growing liberalization of the global economy, it's creating a system where at every single increment, there's no incentive to do the moral thing. It has every incentive to basically employ children and to be as exploitative as possible.
Right. So through the government eyes, it's more beneficial for these children to work than to go to school.
Right. And so would you say then that foreign government investment in diamonds through the government is institutionalizing, these sort of repressions or against the different echelons of society, women, laborers, students, kids?
Yeah.
The government has definitely institutionalized the cycle, and it's the system that creates these materials is definitely fueled by the government, and created by the government, and pushed forward by, really, it's us wanting the cheapest goods possible.
So then would you say that globalization hurting rights development in the country, or would you say it's simply just not helping it?
It's gray. So obviously globalization includes the flow of ideas, and so women's rights and all that sort of stuff are flowing across the borders, they're coming in. However, an interesting thing to note is that of women in the country who are participating in sort of feminist organizations, about 80% of them want national unity over their own rights. And this is because they've seen their communities be ravaged for so long that all they want is a stable society where they can come together and even survive. So obviously the ideas of rights are coming into there, but exploitation and the political power in that struggle is effectively hurting the development of these ideas in the society. So they have exposure but not development.
We have time?
Thank you.
Yep. All right.
You
Thank you
answered
very
many
much.
questions. Thank you.